Hello, my name is Diane Buglioli, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of a very special place here on Staten Island. We provide services to people with developmental disabilities. But today I'm here in the capacity of the co-chairperson of the Willowbrook Property Planning Committee, which is a standing committee of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council, which is the primary advocacy group here on Staten Island and has been since the 1960s. Their focus and their mission has to do with people with developmental disabilities. And we are sponsoring this series of shows on CTV, and it's titled Willowbrook Revisited. And what we're doing is revisiting, if you will, the story of Willowbrook from its very beginnings with the property itself through till present time. Willowbrook is not just an area in Staten Island, but when we refer to it, we're talking about Willowbrook State School. And Willowbrook State School was the focus of an expose that was done in the 1970s with Geraldo Rivera, Eyewitness News. And it told about the conditions that existed at that state total care institution. We're very fortunate to have with us today two authors, both of whom are professors at the College on Staten Island. I'll have them introduce themselves, but they've published a book, The History and Sociology of Willowbrook State School, and that's exactly what we'll be focused on today, is the book and their findings, and it's a very, very interesting presentation. So just if you introduce yourselves, please.
Yeah. I'm David Goode. I'm a faculty member at the College of Staten Island. I've been there for about 25 years, and I've been very interested in Willowbrook for that time, collecting information and data all the time that I've been there. And I ended up starting to write a book about 10 years ago and almost completed it, and finally got some help from a person who had some knowledge of the field and an appreciation for the importance of the topic, Darryl Hill, who I'll let introduce himself.
Yes, hi, I'm Darryl Hill. I'm Associate Professor of Psychology at the College of Staten Island and the Graduate Center in Manhattan. I'm a social psychologist. I do history also, history of psychology, and that's one of the things that kind of attracted me to this project. I was interested in the general connection between how gender and sexuality are shaped by historical moments or movements or times. And for me, this book project really started about 11 years ago when I arrived at the College of Staten Island, knowing a little bit about Willowbrook State School, but my office was right across the hallway from David's. And as colleagues, we started chatting, and I remember talking with David about his work at Willowbrook, and he was very inspiring. And we went off in our separate directions. I started my own series of research studies on Willowbrook, and eventually, David and I came together again on this book project.
Okay, just for the audience to realize that the College of Staten Island is located on the former grounds of Willowbrook, as is the Elizabeth Connolly Resource Center and the Institute for Basic Research. So the basic piece of property that we're talking about, where Willowbrook State School is located, is bounded by Forest Hill Road, Rockland Avenue, Willowbrook Park, and Victory Boulevard. So there's so much. There's so much to discuss between the history and the sociology of it. This, maybe first to explain, Willowbrook State School was the state of the art in terms of treatment at the time. Not to mean that it was a positive thing, but it was what existed, which is this total care institution. So maybe first, in your book you talk about some of this. So if you just could give the audience a sense of what is a total care institution? What does that entail?
Sure. Well, I'll start, and Darryl, please interrupt. When I first came into sociology in the 1960s, one of the basic topics that everybody studied was the total institution. It was a book by yes, it was so, and it's one of the things that has motivated me to write this book. The fact that that topic has kind of become not a central topic in the social sciences, and I don't think in psychology either. And yet we have so many total institutions in our society that continue to operate. Willowbrook was a good example of one of them. And for me, the the interest began as a sociologist before I ever entered the field, because this was a central professional topic. And then it turned out I went to California and worked at Pacific State Hospital, which was a sister institution to Willowbrook, and actually had some research projects going on cooperatively with Willowbrook State School. And I wrote a book about that experience. When I got here to the College of Staten Island, it was kind of a natural thing for me to then, begin to start looking at Willowbrook State School and what happened here. And for me, and I think even for Darryl, because Darryl, 11 years is a long time ago too, it's kind of a circuitous and long route. Like, what is this about? Why are we doing this? And as I've been doing more and more thinking about it, my ideas about what I'm doing have changed. And now I see that, my interest really kind of stems from the basic dynamics of human society. Willowbrook is a kind of contradiction. On the one hand, it represents the best of humanity, the fact that we want to try to take care of and help people, and that we have that as part of who we are as a species. On the other hand, we have this horrible also capability of being extremely cruel, and negotiating that and finding out who is it we're supposed to be kind to and who is it we're not supposed to, has been part of human society since its inception. And this is just a kind of instance of that, a modern instance, because back then there weren't institutions to do this. You didn't like somebody, you killed them, you banished them. In modern society, we built these institutions, and the institutions have these both functions. On the one hand, to protect society, and on the other hand, to supposedly help people at the same time. So Willowbrook, to me, has come to occupy a kind of symbolic importance as a critical kind of instant of how a society negotiates these boundaries.
The other basic contradiction I find in the idea of the total institution as it relates to Willowbrook is that sociologists would say that total institutions control and regulate every aspect of day-to-day life of the people who live there. And it's an attempt, obviously, to protect them, to maybe help rehabilitate them, or at least protect them from harm. So the institution is designed to control and regulate almost every aspect. Regimented feeding, showering was done almost prison style. The changing of clothes, if there were any, that sort of thing. Every aspect of life was supposed to be regulated, but the paradox here, the contradiction, is that it was a total failure at most of that. At a total failure at controlling their lives, because at times Willowbrook was totally out of control. And other times regulating their lives, well, the institution wasn't protecting a lot of the residents from harm. It was a real, and it really failed. So the mission was, I think, something we could all get behind, but in reality, it just was a disaster.
It's an interesting parallel between the conversation we just had and the conversations that were being had in the 1930s, late on Staten Island, about this very institution. There were people who were, kind of suspicious about the whole thing, and about whether this was going to really be a good place, because it was known for a long time that places like this, even if their intent was to help, there weren't resources, people weren't being treated very well. And then there were people who also felt, no, we really owe it to these people. And when you look at the particular site, which is the Willowbrook site, it was a park and it was extremely beautiful. And you see in the Staten Island Advance letters saying, well, we don't want to take a park like this and make it, into an institution, And then you see people saying, well, because it's a park and so beautiful, we really should make it for the children. The children, really would be an appropriate placement for them. So there's always been this kind of ambivalence about, what Willowbrook is going to be and what it turned out to be as well.
I mean, why do you think it's important to discuss Willowbrook now and what it was at that time, what your findings were in terms of what the conditions were, everyday life? Darryl talks about the regimentation of it and the control aspects of it. First, I believe it was set up for 1,500 people, right? And so it ends up, when it's out of control, with 6,000 people living there.
Or more,
So why the discussion? Why the discussion today?
I think a lot of people look at history and think, that's in the past and it's all over with, and we should just leave it there in the past and let's move on. And I think in many ways in the history of disabilities, we maybe have moved a little bit beyond Willowbrook, certainly in the US. And then again at the other time, I mean, a lot of these atrocities that we document in our book, you can simply open up the New York Times and see it happening now. What was it, 2 weeks ago? Again, physical, sexual abuse are happening against people with disabilities, still in institutional settings. And for me, that just says that our book is about the history, but it's also about now. These are concerns that we as a society have failed to resolve fully and put to rest, and they're still with us.
Yeah.
I think that that's true, and one of the there are a lot of reasons I think why we should discuss Willowbrook today. Partly because the social forces that created places like Willowbrook still create places like Willowbrook, and we still have total institutions in our society, massively so. I don't know if we'll get to it later on, but Willowbrook was kind of the center of the deinstitutionalization movement, and that meant that they were closing down institutions for populations, especially mentally ill and people who were mentally deficient. And the idea was that we were going to place people into more normal settings. As it turns out to be, that the degree to which that's true is problematic. There's been a lot of institutional transfers where you have people who were mentally ill who might have been in psychiatric hospitals, and many of them are in prisons now. You have people who are living in places like Willowbrook, and they're living in maybe smaller places, but they're still highly regimented. They may not be integrated into the society. So you have laws that still focus away from the family as the basic care unit, and you know, many people have relatives that they end up putting into nursing homes, and that's structured into the way that Title 19 works in our society. We don't, I mean, it is now possible to get waivers and to take care of your relative and be paid for it, but that's not the way it has been structured.
So, I mean,
for 40 years.
it begs the question then that, you know, is it the size that makes a total institution bad, or is it the basic tenets underneath it, the philosophy that's managing that system?
Well, I think one of the things that our book suggests, and probably there's ample evidence to suggest it, is it's more of a societal thing. It's more of an attitude in our society about people with disabilities. And it's subtle sometimes, and it's hard to wrap your head around sometimes when you're working in an institution and doing the day-to-day work of an institution, and you don't realize that if you refer to a resident in one particular way or talk about them as or make a joke about them or something like that, that's part of that process of dehumanization, that's part of the process of belittling or devaluing that person because they have a challenge with their abilities. And I think that's a bigger societal thing, and that's a bigger problem.
I would agree, because if you transfer some of the way that someone is trained to work with someone, and if you put them in a smaller setting, if they don't have the training and understanding or compassion, they're going to still they're going to approach that person in the same way, whether they're in a big institution or they're in a small group home, or if they're in a small family care setting. So it really has to do with the larger piece of how do we view people. It goes back to, you know, Wolfenberger and normalization and that type of thing, that we treat people differently.
Well, this is why we have to study the everyday life of places like Willowbrook, because I don't think that we understand them. And when I mean we don't understand them, I think we understand them a little bit, because we study them, and we as scientists, and we try to be, I think, you know, fair in our analysis, and it doesn't kind of jive with some of the prejudices that people have. There are a lot of misunderstandings about places like Willowbrook that you know, can be corrected through empirical research. And just as an example, that, you know, no matter how bad you set up a place, people will try to be human, and they will live humanly, and you'll see wonderful acts and beautiful things, and people extending themselves. You know, that when you think of Willowbrook, anyone who knows about it, that's kind of the last thing that occurs to you. But when you listen to people who have been at Willowbrook, these stories are pretty common. And there's a problem with learning from Willowbrook. It's a real problem. And the problem is that when you Willowbrook is like everybody's experience of it. That's what you know of it, you know. And everyone's experience of Willowbrook was very different. It was different just because people are different. So you take any two of us and put us in the same situation, and you ask what happened, we're going to get different stories. On top of that, Willowbrook, and I think you wanted this to come out in the discussion, was a complicated place, and it changed over time. And you know, you listen to one person who went there, even sometimes in the same time period, and they'll tell a story about Willowbrook that sounds like, well, you know, it was bad, but I had friends, and you know, we went out and this. And then another one will say, I never went off the ward. I was treated like an animal. And so, you know, it's the same quote place. But once you start to realize the complexities of both the experience and then the actual facts of the matter, you know, who was at the ward at the time, who was in charge, you know. If you were lucky, Bill Bronston was in charge, one of the authors of our book, because you know, he was very, very humane and very, you know, oriented, trying to help things, and you know, extended himself, you know, immensely to the patients. But often that wasn't true. Often, you know, and Darryl and I talk about this in our book, the doctors there were indifferent, and not to be offensive to anyone, but you know, to work at Willowbrook for most physicians was kind of, you know, relinquishing your Hippocratic oath and just saying, I really won't be a doctor anymore. And it was very difficult, you know, for people wanting to do that role, to actually exist here at Willowbrook. So it's complicated, and you know, you don't.
It has so many facets, and it has such texture to it. Is why I think it's a fascinating subject.
Even working with the materials and preparing the book, our two co-authors, Jean Reese and Bill Bronston, provided us with, well, Jean provided us with a manuscript that she had written about her experiences at Willowbrook, firsthand working in a nursing unit, that was, in many ways, I think to many, when they read her manuscript, it was a real kind of sunshine and apple pie kind of place. And probably a lot of good was going on in that. She worked in a research unit, and they had money and support. And so the kids had clothes, and they were fed treats, and life was maybe not so bad there. And I think the kids even probably strove to get onto those good units.
But I also think, and I think Darryl's absolutely right, that you know, because these kind of units were better places, their quality of life was better at them. But Jean particularly wanted, she fell in love with these children that she was working with, and she wanted more than anything else to give them a life, to give them a voice, to tell the story of this individual person, you know, which gets lost. And she does this beautifully. I've sent her manuscript to some of the great ethnographers of institutions. I think it's one of the finest pieces of work in recapturing the humanity of, you know, just these different people who ended up being on these wards.
And then you talk about different Willowbrooks. You compare Jean's stories to the stories we got from Bill Bronston, and his speeches that he's given, and his public addresses, and his written letters on the issue. It's hard to even conceive that they're talking about the same place.
Now, for people that don't have a lot of knowledge about Willowbrook, Will Bronston and Wilkins were the two doctors who actually brought Geraldo Rivera into Willowbrook. They used one of their keys to get into one of the buildings, and Geraldo Rivera started this expose, and it resulted in a federal court judgment against the state. And it's interesting because the whole thing hinged on protection from harm. That was the whole hinge of it, that Willowbrook, that the state did not give protection from harm to the people living in there. And so it failed on the very basic level of what, you know,
Can we go after the
was
state?
mission,
Are we
right?
allowed to do that on the camera? Can we just like be honest and go after them? Or how would you like us to word this? Problems at Willowbrook were very severe, very early on, much earlier than 1972. In the mid-50s, the director already said, and this is in our book, we have quotes from the newspaper, that he had wards where he had 2 or 3 people taking care of 100 people. That was from the 50s on. And the conditions here were known to the state. They continued to operate these places, not only here in New York State, to be fair, you know, all over the country.
At one point, Berman even writes all the parents of all the kids that he has addresses for, writes them a letter saying, would you take your kid back?
This is Dr. Berman?
Yeah, Dr. Berman, the director, says he's having so much problem managing it. And I think this is a basic problem. The need was so great. And yet there was just so little attention paid to this issue from the state.
Well, but I think
people's hands were tied.
Yeah, the point that I would make would be that the state not only operated these places knowledgeably and set up conditions that were really sub-kennel-like conditions. Animals would not be allowed to live like this. And And not only did they set these places up and know about it, but when they were challenged, when people would try to say something about them, the state had a whole apparatus that it assembled to quote experts, and these were real experts, but they were experts who signed on to the idea that institutions were okay and that you could have a good institution. One of the points that we make in our book, and I think sociology makes, is that that is not possible. There are no such things as good total institutions. A big place where you have people who are on kind of relatively powerless or at the bottom kind of the social ladder that is administrated by a small number of persons produces social pathology indifferent of the character of the place of
Yeah, but isn't that something that evolves anyway from society? I mean, as you said before, David, before these total institutions, these isolative, segregating settings that they set up for people. Before then, people were banished. They were so. I mean, there's this whole history of the asylum and all of this coming up through centuries. So at that point, in the 1920s and 30s, I mean, it wasn't from some sort of maliciousness on the part of government. It was what. I mean, at that time, doctors told parents, your child is a mongoloid, Down syndrome, but the term was mongoloid at the time. It's better for them because they'll only live till the teenage years anyway. They're going to have heart conditions better with their own. So, I mean, society, as it was saying that this is the path that should be taken. Then we find out that this is not a good path. I mean, and it's one of the reasons we talk about today, because Betty Connolly, our assemblywoman, who was really, carried that torch and just was the person that really stood behind people with disabilities all this time to try and legislate things, said, we are just a couple of budget cuts away from Willowbrook. She always made that statement because, they created this place that they thought was the state of the art. It was this beautiful pastoral setting, as you said, but they didn't fund it. And then they overcrowded it. And then all these other things started to happen. And then came all the learning that this doesn't work. And then came further the learning to say, it's not even that the setting is big, is that there's some misconceptions and some poor philosophies that are in here saying that this person is less than.
Kicking and screaming, they did not want to close, even when all this was, they still didn't want to close the place.
Yeah.
See, to me, the lesson about government in Willowbrook is that you can't trust government. You can't. And government will, it has certain rhetorical level where it'll state certain things about what it's going to do, but you have to be very critical of what those words are. And the history seems to indicate to me exactly what you said, and what Betty said, which is that this could easily turn around and go the other way, and we could end up with Willowbrooks in the future, even if they're not as big as the Willowbrook that we, the idea that we could have people living very low quality of lives, and the government knowing about that.
That concept of less than. I mean, that you can treat someone because they're less than, and of course they're not.
I think it happens, and I think it's almost endemic in our society. The way that our society views people with disabilities or ability challenges is fairly dreadful, I think, and I don't think it's respectful. And so there's no money for it, and no one wants to push up more, no one wants to pay more taxes to do something good about this and to change the. And then they end up in these institutions, and then social processes in the institutions take over, like dehumanization, like other kinds of things that just really end up putting the institution into a downward spiral.
Fiscal conservatism. Social managed care. These are all the things that people are afraid of now, and it's not in the future. It's now. It's like one of the things is in my class that I teach at the college, we have people come in and talk about their experiences. And this last semester, I had a person who had a son with mental illness come into class, and he's already had services for his son taken away because of this managed care model. And he started his, very sad thing. He comes up in front of my class and he looks at the class. He's already crying. He said, "I lost him again." He lost his son. So the mental health community is already in the midst of, seeing people being re-institutionalized because there's not enough money to keep them, in the apartments where they live. Serious problem.
Yeah. So, in terms of the, in terms of, I mean, there's a misunderstanding of the facility. In terms of people don't see it as with the full complexity that it had, let's say. To understand both sides of that issue, and you know that we'll be having other segments that will have people who work there as well as people who live there, and hopefully you'll come back and join us with that. Well, your findings were pretty much the same in the book. I mean, I've read the book, and it's a wonderful book. People should read it, and I want to know more about it. But can you just give us a sense of some of the findings that you had?
Well, one of the interesting things that we started with, David did a lot of the background work on the social history of Willowbrook, and when I came onto the book project, he passed me all these documents that he had collected, speeches, interviews with people who had lived there. Myself and my research assistant, Helen Starro-Giannis, had done some interviews with people who worked there, teachers, occupational therapists, and even a bookkeeper who had worked there. And we assembled all these documents about people speaking about Willowbrook. There were even one of the student at the College of Staten Island had done she'd gone out and interviewed some of the old residents and captured some of their words. And we had this massive pile of documents to really sort through and try to figure out how to tell that story, or how to tell the many stories about Willowbrook. And really that's what we were tasked with in putting this together. And I think what I tried to do was weave together all these different stories to try to show how complex Willowbrook was. We have sections in the book on everything from the physical grounds and the buildings, the swimming pool and other facilities, but also about labor relations between the staff and
you did a lot of work on the
administration.
research. He added tremendous.
And the research,
Yeah.
the
We might
research
wanna
was
talk
going
about that a
on.
little.
Yes, we should
And
talk about that.
well, actually, I mean, isn't it one of the studies in terms of informed consent regarding the hepatitis research project that was at Willowbrook?
Yeah.
Which probably people don't know about, and it's a major case in medical history.
A lot of the state schools across the nation were attractive to researchers because they had a captive population to do research with, and at the time it was unregulated, so there was no oversight of any of this, and it was really the Wild West in medical research for a number of years, and Willowbrook was part of that. Other schools, we know about Furno in Massachusetts, where they were feeding some of their kids radioactive calcium laced into their Quaker oats to test whether they could
I've read about
retain
that, yeah.
retain the nutrients if they were exposed to a radioactive dose. Or at Willowbrook, where they were basically infecting kids with hepatitis.
That's really an interesting topic, and what I'd like to do is,
Yeah.
because I know we're coming to the end of the 30-minute segment, is that I'd like to stop right there and pick that up right from that point of the informed consent. And if the two of you would come back and join us to finish that piece, and some of the other questions that I have about the book and Willowbrook.
Sure,
of course.
If that's good for you.
Yes, of course.
I hope the audience is getting as much information as I'm getting, and I've been involved in the story of Willowbrook for many years, and it's all very fascinating, and seeing new pieces of it, new texture to it. So please join us again in our next segment about Willowbrook Revisited. Thank you so much, Dave and Darryl, for being here.
Thank you.
And we'll hope to see all of you soon. Thank you.